When you think about it, that's what life is all about. All of life is really about the power of persuade. Your spouse, your children, your friends, your colleagues, your business associates. And I tell people all the time, learn how to improve your powers of persuasion. Learn how to write very well, learn how to talk very well, and learn how to be an example of what you want people to do by doing it yourself.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is David Rubenstein. David is the co-founder and current chair of the board of the Carlyle Group, one of the most successful private equity firms in the world. David is a fixture in Washington, where he's advised presidents going back to Jimmy Carter. He is a fixture on the nonprofit scene in Washington, where he has chaired or been on the board of the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Archives, and the Library of Congress. In our conversation today, we talk about his history at the Carlyle Group, cultural and political situation we face currently in the country, in his book on past presidents. I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. Welcome to All Things Negotiation, David Rubenstein.
My pleasure to be here.
So you and I met over 20 years ago through the Council on Foreign Relations, and I remember specifically the conversation we had, and I was so impressed with you. You drilled down on what I was doing in Silicon Valley, the boutique investment bank I was running. You were at the time running the Carlyle Group, a much larger organization. But you seemed genuinely interested in what I was doing, and that left a big impression on me. I think you're well known for building relationships and being effective at that. Can you give us a few of your secrets on things that you have found effective in building relationships in the context of ongoing relationships and negotiation?
Well, by nature, I was not a outgoing, hail fellow, well-met type of personality. You know, the life of the party and all of that. I was probably the death of the party mostly. So when I was growing up, nobody ever thought I would be an outgoing kind of personality. And what happened was I basically started at Carlisle in 1987, and my partners that I had recruited were people that had MBAs, and they had very good finance skills. I didn't have that. I was a lawyer by training. So I decided to make myself useful. Even though I was the founder of the firm, I have to find myself a role in the firm, or otherwise my partners who I recruited might say, "What are you doing here?" So I decided to take on the role of being a fundraiser. And so I learned how to speak, because over and over again, I would do public speeches. And eventually, if you do enough of them, you'll probably be reasonably good at it. And so I began to develop more of an outgoing personality, which is to say how to connect with other people. So I wouldn't say there's any one or two secrets, but I think among the things that I think are very good to do, and I've tried to use over the years, are self-deprecating humor. I think that's helpful. Always asking people about themselves. People love to talk about themselves. Ask people about themselves. Also, learn how to listen to what people are actually saying. Don't just ask people something and then don't pay attention to what they've said. And then ultimately, try to enjoy what you're doing, because people want to be around people that are happy, enjoyable, having a good time. And if you're sour and you're kind of a depressed type of person. And so now I have lots of TV shows, and I make a lot of speeches, and I do a lot of interviews, but it was not something anybody would have predicted 20 or 30 years ago.
So one thing I take away from that is that was a learned thing in your life. And so people can learn to be persuasive and learn to be effective negotiators. One of your mentors was Ted Sorenson, and some of our younger listeners might not know who he was, but he was famously speechwriter for John F. Kennedy, advisor. You have said that persuasion by both speaking and writing are important to learn. What did you learn from Ted Sorenson, and what specific things did he do that were persuasive to you?
Well, Ted Sorenson, for those who don't know, was at 31 years old, the top speechwriter and really domestic policy advisor to President Kennedy. And he wrote really Profiles in Courage. He really wrote the great inaugural address of 1961 that President Kennedy gave. Ted Sorenson was the wordsmith. When I went to practice law in New York after graduating law school, he was a partner at the law firm that I went to, and I went there in part because I wanted to meet with him and see if I could get some of his pixie dust to rub off of me. I learned from him that, writing is a skill that takes a lot of time to perfect.
You talk about your fundraising experience at Carlyle, and as far as I know, you may have raised more private equity money than any other person, and so you're kind of legendary there. It can't have always been easy. You've talked about persistence being a key skill in negotiation and getting things done. Did you sometimes have to visit people multiple times? And maybe talk about the role of persistence in negotiation and whether that played a role in your fundraising.
It's very rare that somebody will show up to make a presentation on fundraising, and the person to whom you're speaking will say, wow, I really wanted this kind of fund to invest in. I was waiting for somebody like you to show up on my doorstep. Where do I write the check? That doesn't happen. So when I was starting the firm, we didn't have a track record, and people always want to see a track record. So not having a track record, you had to be better at selling people on things than if you had a long track record that would sell itself. So I had to develop the skill of persistence and not take it personally. So one of our biggest individual investors in Geneva, I went to see him 9 times, and the eighth times he said no, no, no. Finally, the 9th time he said, look, please leave me alone. I'll give you some money. Don't come back again. So persistence paid off a bit, and then he opened doors to other people that he knew. So persistence pays off, but you have to. And when you're fundraising, you have to be polite. You can't be arrogant and hit people over the head and say, you have to give me this money, or my firm is the greatest firm in the world. You have to be pleasant and accept what they say. Listen to them. Always listen, because people will tell you what they think pretty much at the beginning of a meeting. So I don't like to start a meeting by saying, let me tell you why this fund is great and why you should invest in it. I like to ask people, tell me a bit about yourself, what you're focused on now. Tell me a bit about your background. Tell me a bit about what you like and what you don't like. And then people will tell you something about themselves or what their interests are, you can therefore take your message that you're going to deliver about your fund or whatever you're trying to sell and kind of fit it into what they've already told you about themselves. So I remember when I interviewed Oprah Winfrey once, I said, you're a great interviewer. She said, no, I'm not a great interviewer. I'm a great listener. I listen to what people say, and then I react to that. And I always remember that.
So interesting. Listening is one of those things that is it's ubiquitous in terms of people's knowledge and advice around listening. You hear it all the time, but I think very few people are good at it. You've recently written a very effective book on the presidents, where you interview some of the biographers and people most knowledgeable about those presidents. I remember once, and since you have met with a lot of the recent presidents, I remember someone telling me that Bill Clinton, listening was his key skill in negotiation, that he was an aerobic listener. The fact that he would listen intensely was the major event of the conversation. Was that your experience with Bill Clinton? And can you think of other presidents who you thought were effective listeners?
Well, to get to the presidency, you have to listen to what people are saying, because otherwise you won't be able to massage your message. So I think Bill Clinton was a very effective listener. I think others that got there listened as well. Some maybe not as well as others did, but the person for whom I worked in the White House, Jimmy Carter, he started out with no chance of getting to be the Democratic nominee in 1976, but he listened to what people said, and he crafted his argument and his political message to what people had been telling him. So I think really good politicians listen to what people say, and I think it can be more effective than listening to what pollsters tell you.
Well, let's finish up with a couple more questions on Carlisle before we turn to the presidents and current events. At Carlisle, in addition to fundraising, you were well known for heading up recruiting. And 2 things that you've mentioned that you feel like are important as you recruited people were that they had high integrity and that they were smarter than you. How do you assess in an interview whether someone has integrity or not? And how did you flesh that out of the people you hired at Carlisle?
Well, I hired a lot of people who were famous, Jim Baker, George Herbert Walker Bush, Frank Carlucci. They were prominent already. Their records were known. The trick is figuring out whether younger people have the integrity that you want and the skill set. And what I'm always looking for are people that are in terms of younger people that want to work hard, but not obsessively so that it's detrimental to their health, but want to work hard, are pretty intelligent, know how to write, know how to communicate orally, are highly ethical. And how do you determine whether somebody's ethical? Well, you can ask questions that might determine whether, if they were in a certain situation, what would they do? If they had inside information, what would they do with it? So you can generally get that, but not every interview goes perfectly in terms of deciding whether the person has all the skill sets you want. I've made hiring mistakes, and you have to live with them. And eventually, the trick is trying to figure out how to exit somebody in a graceful way. So I wasn't that good at firing people, because I usually, when somebody was given to me to fire, I would wind up hiring them and promoting them. So eventually my firm said, maybe we should have somebody else do the firing. And so they got another person in the firm who was much better at firing them. And he did it skillfully by never using the word fire. He would just say, at the end of a week, he would call the person in and say, well, I think we have a very good package for you. That will be a package that will enable you to, financially do okay for a while. And so they didn't really know they'd been fired. They just knew they were getting some money to go away.
That's a great story. Private equity firms are famous for internal, let's call them dynamics. So you had two co-founders, and probably the fact that you had different roles minimized to some extent the conflict. But do you have any stories of either with your co-founders or other people at the firm where you had conflicts and you had to work through them, and what worked well in that process?
Well, sure. Actually, we've rewritten the story of Carlisle a bit, but at the beginning, there were three of us. And the three of us basically got along pretty well. We never yelled at each other. We never, stabbed each other in the back. We never kind of tried to get two against one. We always said, look, you each have your own areas of responsibility. We'll defer to each other in other's area of responsibility, and generally try to, be as polite as possible to each other. So we also did something else. We didn't really socialize. I found that when you see people all the time, you work with them and you socialize with them, at some point, there's you just say, I've seen too much of this person. This person's habits get on me, and I don't like them. And so basically, the three of us, Bill Conway oversaw the investments, Dan Daniello did the administrative related and operational things, and I did the fundraising and the public relations and the recruiting. And so we didn't get in each other's way. We deferred to each other. Obviously, we communicated our views, but generally deferred to each other, and it worked out pretty well.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership transitions at Carlisle. I think you're still chairman of the board, but you've had some transitions historically. I think some of them have gone on well and maybe some not so well. What have you learned through that? And you can speak either to ones that you felt like went well and how you negotiated that, or things that didn't go well in leadership transitions.
Well, Carlisle for a long time had, of the three founders, two of us were the co-CEOs. And when we reached the age of 69, we concluded that we're ready to step back and go to the next generation. We had two people in the firm that were kind of ready. One had been a deputy to Bill Conway as an investment person. Another had been doing many different things at Carlisle. And the two of them, we designated them as the co-CEOs in the next generation. But they didn't get along with each other that well. And I think in the end, there was a little bit of a tussle. But transitions always have a challenge. And in China, I am told that there is a curse. And a curse that you can say to somebody is, may you be condemned to live in a time of transition. Well, I can see why the Chinese might have that curse, because when transitions are always difficult, transitions in government and business and in family life, everything is difficult. So when you have a transition from founders who are kind of, the sun gods of an organization to people who are not the founders, there's always some transition tension. Some of the other firms and private equity have made very successful transitions. Some have had less successful ones. But and ours didn't initially work out quite as well as we had hoped it would be. But now we're very happy with where we are.
Well, before we leave your career, your very successful career at Carlisle, you bring up that you had recruited George Herbert Walker Bush, post-presidency for him, Jim Baker, another luminary in politics. You guys spent a lot of time together. You flew around the Middle East at one point. Those are the kinds of trips where you really get to know people. Talk about maybe each of them for a second and what you learned from them about negotiation and persuasion.
Well, Jim Baker was one of the most successful post-World War II professionals in government. He had served as chief of staff under Ronald Reagan, maybe the gold standard for chief of staffs, then Secretary of Treasury under Reagan's second term, and then Secretary of State under George Herbert Walker Bush. And he was a master at negotiating. He was very detail-oriented, very focused. If you ask him to do something, he would always ask you questions about why you wanted to do it. He'd always make sure he understood everything going on. And one of the more impressive people I'd ever met. George Herbert Walker Bush was the nicest person I ever met, practically. I mean, he's such a polite person, so genteel in the way he treated other people, always careful about other people's feelings, and never wanted to upset anybody, and a terrific person. I really admired both of them enormously. And I learned a lot from both of them.
Well, let's turn a little bit to the current political situation. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, everyone recognizes that we're in a polarized environment. There's lots of mistrust, and that makes negotiation difficult. Do you have any general thoughts and strategies about how to best negotiate in our polarized environment, either anecdotes of how you've done that effectively or what you'd recommend to others?
It's a complicated situation. For the last 11 years, I've hosted a dinner on Capitol Hill for members of Congress only once a month. And I interview a great historian about American history on the theory that members of Congress would like to hear about it. And members of Congress like it because they get to come and there's no press there. They can sit with people from the opposite party, the opposite house, and talk with people they normally aren't allowed to publicly talk to. And then they learn something about American history. And I've gotten to know a lot of members reasonably well from that process. And I would say that, today it's a very, the members like the dinners because it's so unusual. Today, there's no real bipartisanship. When I was working on Capitol Hill briefly in the 1970s and then later under President Carter at the White House, bipartisanship was thought to be a good thing. Today, bipartisanship is not thought to be a good thing. And therefore, people are either committed to the left or committed to the right. And the city is much different than it used to be. And, you used to get ahead by being known as a good bipartisanship kind of person. You could get along with both sides. Today, if you're seen as bipartisan, you're probably not going to advance in your party, either party, because it's not seen as an appropriate thing. It's a sad situation, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. In the end, one of the problems we have is money. Money is so prevalent in politics today that members of Congress are spending so much of their time raising money, and you raise money from the far left or the far right. You don't raise money by saying, I'm going to go to Washington and be right down the middle. I'm going to do what's right for the country, whether it's far left or far right. That will not raise any money. And so since money is so important, members of Congress get pulled to the far left and the far right. They don't like it, but they know that's the reality. And so if there was anything you could do to change politics in Washington, D.C., it'd be to eliminate the prevalence of money in politics. I think Citizens United is so popular among certain parts of the political spectrum that I don't think it's going to change, and I don't think the justices are likely to reverse that. But I can't speak for the court, of course. But I think it's unlikely that as long as we have the view that political money is political speech and we have freedom of speech in our country, I don't think you're likely to change that decision. So that'd be my guess.
Well, democracy seems like it's under threat. As we think about some of the key stakeholder groups in that negotiation, Congress, you've got Congress, you've got the business community, you've got the legal community, you've got the academic community. Some would say that they're not acting with courage. Do you agree with that? Or do you have advice for any of those groups on how they could behave differently to preserve democracy?
Well, I've thought that if John Kennedy were to write his book today, Profiles in Courage, it might be an empty book compared to what he wrote about. Courage is easy to talk about, but hard to actually find because people don't want to be attacked. People don't want to be vilified. And today you have physical attacks on people. You have all kinds of political attacks on people. Social media has scared people because you do find violence very often now as a way of people trying to settle scores. So I wouldn't say there's a lot of courage in Washington, D.C. these days because members of Congress or don't want to be vilified. They don't want to be physically attacked. They don't want their members of their family to be physically attacked. And many of them don't want to lose their fundraising base either. So it's a complicated situation. I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon, unfortunately.
One thing that I've heard repeatedly, and it's mostly from former Congress people, is let's just take the Republican Senate, for example, who might be amongst the least courageous people in terms of those groups, from my opinion. They've said that the reason that the Republican senators don't stand up to the administration is they like their jobs. They just like being senators. And that's a hard answer for me to hear. Do you agree with that? Is that what you hear? Or if we're talking specifically about the Republican Senate, why do you think they're not pushing back on any of the things that are very different than the traditional Republican Party platform?
Yeah. Well, I can't really speak for them. I would say my impression from afar would be that they think that if they resist a lot of what is being proposed by the administration, they will be, quote, primaried, and therefore they would have to fight a primary campaign, and they could well lose it, and some members of Congress have stepped down. But it's an interesting phenomenon. When I talk to members of Congress, they generally like the job they have. They complain about it, so forth. But generally, members rarely retire at a young age. They rarely say, I just don't like the way Washington's operating. They want to be reelected. But interestingly, when they do retire or they lose an election, but particularly if they retire, I find when I talk to them, they're never as happy as they were retired. So in other words, they spent all these years being afraid of being defeated in an election or being primaried, but when they actually get out, they're never so happy.
Maybe you should invite some of the retired members of Congress to your dinners to tell them how great it is, so the current people might want to move on more quickly.
Well, that's a good idea. I'll think about it.
David Brooks from the New York Times has famously said that some of these groups, whether it's law firms or academic institutions, need to negotiate with the administration collectively rather than being picked off one by one. Thoughts on that strategy? Do groups need to form if they are resisting some of the current administration's directions?
It's very difficult to get groups with disparate backgrounds and different interests to kind of come together and en masse say we're going to be tougher on the administration. So I don't think it's likely to happen. And realistically, the administration has such a loud voice and has so much political power that it's very difficult for these individual industries to kind of combat what the administration is doing. And I'm skeptical that will happen. I think unless a president of the United States' popularity goes down and he is not seen as a very popular person, you're probably going to see a lot of what we have seen in the last couple of years continue.
That's discouraging. Let's talk a little bit about negotiations and relationships with our allies. It's my perspective that we're suffering a bit, particularly with some of our traditional allies. How do you think the administration is doing on maintaining our relationships with our allies?
Well, clearly the administration has different views on who our allies are and who they want to, I would say, support. Clearly, the tariffs have had some impact with our allies, and President Trump seems to have a different view on who our best friends are overseas compared to other presidents, so it's hard to know who our allies are. But traditionally, our best allies were Western European countries, and many of them have found dealing with President Trump more difficult than they would have preferred or might have liked. And our two closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, have had some challenges as well. So President Trump has made some changes in who he regards as our best allies from what previous presidents had thought, and it's a little upsetting to some of these other countries. But obviously, President Trump has managed to maintain his popularity despite some of these challenges to our traditional allies.
Do you think they're going to be forgiving? Let's say we had a new administration, or do you think some of the damage to those relationships is more medium or long term?
Hard to say at this point. I'd say it depends on who his successor is. If his successor is someone that's very close to him and also seen as a MAGA supporter, then people will probably say, yes, this is a turn in how the United States is going to treat us for quite some time into the future. And so we shouldn't think that the good old days are going to come back anytime soon. On the other hand, if his successor is somebody that is more traditional, then people will probably say what we saw under President Trump was a bit of a aberration and is not the continued foreign policy of the United States. It's just too hard to say because we won't know who his successor is for quite some time.
Sure. A book that you and I both like is Richard Neustadt's book on presidential power. And in that book, he says the president only has the power to persuade. President Trump has taken a more transactional rather than persuasive and relational approach. So is Neustadt not right? Or how do you feel about the transactional versus relational approach of the president in terms of his negotiations?
Well, for those who aren't familiar, Richard Neustadt was a professor at the Kennedy School, helped to start the Kennedy School, professor at Harvard, and he was an advisor to the presidents. Richard Neustadt's book was about presidential power, and he basically used a lot of the Truman administration, which is what he was pretty knowledgeable about, as an indicator of presidential power. And what he's famously said is the president doesn't have as much power as you might think, but he's got the power to persuade. But when you think about it, that's what life is all about. All of life is really about the power to persuade. Your spouse, your children, your friends, your colleagues, your business associates. You may not have the legal ability to get them to do what you want, but you might be able to persuade them. And I tell people all the time, learn how to improve your powers of persuasion. Learn how to write very well, learn how to talk very well, and learn how to be an example of what you want people to do by doing it yourself. And that's a very effective way to persuade people. So I think Richard Neustadt was correct that the president's legal powers aren't quite as great as maybe you think, but he does have the power to persuade. And obviously President Trump has been persuasive to many of his people in his in his core support group in terms of Republicans in the House and Senate. Whether that will continue with a successor, or I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, I guess I see that a little bit differently. I would say that the traditional way that we think about persuasion and negotiation is an anathema to the way he does things, which are to make decisions and kind of deal with consequences and persuasion later. So I guess I see that a little bit differently.
Well, he obviously has a different style of negotiating, which is to say, this is what I'm going to do, and that you should go along with it, or there could be consequences. You could argue it's a very effective way to persuade people because he's obviously managed to convince the Republicans in the Senate, the Republicans in the House to follow him. So maybe it's not as bad a technique of persuasion, or you can redefine the word persuasion, perhaps, as the traditional way.
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be I'd say that can work in the short term, but not in the long term. And the interests of a country are all long-term interests. And so I'm concerned that kind of short-term transactional thinking might look good. I think President Trump did an excellent job, for example, in Gaza and getting the hostages out. And so we'd say that's a win, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. Great work. How's he doing in terms of long-term relationships in the Middle East? It's too early to tell, and I'm concerned, frankly.
Well, in the Middle East, I just returned from the Middle East, and I would say in certain parts of the Middle East, he's extremely popular. In the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC, he's a very, very popular person. In Israel, he's very, very popular. In other parts of the Middle East, I think he's also pretty popular. Now, some of his popularity may not extend to all the groups in the United States that care about these issues, but in the Middle East, while his techniques have been different than other presidents, he's actually managed to please and be really relatively popular in the GCC countries and in Israel, which is not easy to do.
Yeah, well, let's leave politics. I guess the final thing I'd say there is popularity may not equal long-term success. I think sometimes you have to do the unpopular things. I'm thinking back to, your mentor, Jimmy Carter, what he did at Camp David, and really the breakthrough that he and Cyrus Vance had in that negotiation, which had some long-term implications, wasn't very popular with most people in the Middle East, but at least bridged for quite a while. Any insights on that?
Well, Carter really deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for what he did in 1978. He didn't get it then because you have to be nominated in February 1 of the year in which you're getting the prize, and he hadn't been nominated in February 1 because of the events occurred in September of that year. But Carter later got it, and maybe to some extent for what he'd done at Camp David. At Camp David, he spent 2 weeks trying to persuade Sadat and Begin to agree to something, and they did agree to it, and the peace agreement is still in place 40 plus years later. So it is an incredible work of statesmanship. President Trump's Middle East settlement is different. He didn't spend as much personal time doing it as maybe Carter did. On the other hand, he had a very effective surrogates helping to negotiate a deal, and we'll see whether it lasts as long as Carter's agreement did. But there's no doubt that reputations have been lost trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to some of your other work. You've been the chair of the board at the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, the National Archives. I'm sure there's never been an American more involved in helping the country through some of the nonprofit. In my experience with nonprofit and cultural institutions, often those are complex. There's so many different stakeholders. They often have conflicting interests. We think of some of those Washington-based organizations that you've been a key part of. You've got the federal government, you've got the local government, you've got the donors, you've got the artists, you've got the public, and they're just not all going to agree on a direction. Maybe tell us what you've learned about balancing or mediating stakeholder interests and any of those organizations and stories you have from those experiences.
Well, the organizations I've chaired were I chaired the Smithsonian Institution for a number of years, and I chair the support board for the Library of Congress, and I now chair the National Gallery of Art, and for 14 years I chaired the Kennedy Center. And so they're all organizations that get a fair amount of support from the federal government, and you have to be attentive to the members of Congress who often appropriate the money for these organizations. But in the end, citizens of the country want these organizations to succeed, and generally they've been pretty bipartisan. Clearly, right now, less bipartisanship than there was historically, and maybe that will change it back to what we've historically had. But right now, I've learned that in the end, you can't listen to too many members of Congress. You can't meet too many people who are citizens who want to contribute to these organizations.
Can you think of any stories from any of those roles where you had to negotiate a high tension thing within the board or within the board and any of those stakeholder groups?
Well, there's always conflicts in terms of getting money out of Congress, pleasing Congress. Clearly, right now, you can see that the Smithsonian is under challenge a bit. There are some view in the administration that the Smithsonian has been too woke, and so that's a bit of a challenge for the Smithsonian right now. And there's some challenge to other organizations that are nonprofit that they've been too woke, and maybe to some extent there was a challenge to the Kennedy Center for that. You do the best you can in these situations. The President of the United States got a lot of power, and it's hard to kind of go against the President of the United States. So in time, these things will probably sort themselves out. But I would say that as a general rule of thumb, citizens should be pleased that many of these organizations exist, and they provide, good research and good opportunities for people, and particularly children, to learn. And I can't encourage parents too much to bring their children to Washington to see some of these incredible museums and other organizations that the taxpayers have largely funded.
The Trump administration essentially, as far as I can tell through the media, sort of did a takeover of the Kennedy Center. How was that negotiated? How did you find out about that? Anything you can instruct us on and what you learned through that?
There was an emails I received saying that I had been relieved as being chairman of the board, and that President Trump would probably be the new chairman of the board. And what can I say? It's unusual to do that, but it happened, and life goes on. So the president is now the chairman of the board, and the Kennedy Center is it's got some challenges, but it's still open for business.
Well, thank you for all of your work there. Have you had the chance to speak to President Trump since you got that email?
I did. He invited me to see him after I left my position, and I had about 45 minutes, an hour conversation with him in the Oval Office about various things in Washington. I've known him for quite a while. I've known him before he became president. I've interviewed him several times, and for my most recent book, I interviewed him as well. What can I say? He's obviously a different personality than some of the other people that have served in that office, and I've known a lot of presidents, almost all of them, since Jimmy Carter. And so he's a different approach and different technique. So what can I say? It's different. He's different.
Let's talk about your book for a minute. I just strongly recommend this book. It's called The Highest Calling. You've written a bunch of books, and I think you have more planned. This one is on past presidents, and you've chosen certain presidents, and you really are a student of the presidency. And I listened to it on Audible, and I would just really recommend that, because what that does is it gives your very substantive intro and then your interview of people who've really drilled into the details. I just found that I learned so much from that. As you have studied presidents, which presidents do you admire as being persuasive and influential and effective negotiators? Obviously, that's a role full of negotiation and friction. Right. So who jumps out to you?
Well, in the history of this country, there's nobody that is, in my view, a greater president than Abraham Lincoln. He took the country through the Civil War, emancipated the slaves, ultimately got the 13th Amendment through Congress. And I think he served as president in our most difficult time. I think George Washington, because he got the presidency off the ground and kind of created a lot of traditions about how the presidency operates, probably our second greatest president. And then after that, there's obviously a jump ball you can to say who the greatest presidents are. But I would say in the 20th century, probably the most impactful one was probably FDR, because he served for a longer period of time than anybody had ever served president, and he got us through the Great Depression and the Second World War. But I think presidents, are people that when you get to know them, they have the same, insecurities, challenges, desires as all humans do, and they just are on a bigger setting. And it's not an easy job. And it's an interesting thing, as I pointed out in the book. I said, why do people want this job? John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson really had to withdraw. He couldn't run for re-election when he really wanted to in 1968. Richard Nixon was impeached, or not impeached, but he was driven from office. I'd say probably would have been impeached, but was driven from office. Gerald Ford couldn't get reelected. Jimmy Carter couldn't get reelected. Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated. And then, George Herbert Walker Bush, not reelected. Challenging kind of job. You're either subject to assassination or not getting reelected or being humiliated in some ways. So why do people want it? Because it's the most powerful job in the world. As I said in the book title, it's the highest calling. What could be better than being president of the United States if you want to change the world? But it is a job that has a lot of challenges to it, and very few people, some do, emerge happier for having done the job and happier, and the American people are like them more after they finish the job than they did before they took the job. That's rare.
Yeah, so thinking back to your comment about most Congress people that sort of graduate and retire happier afterwards, most presidents don't leave that well. And I thought that was a super interesting point from your book. I do think that negotiation, there's so much friction in that role, has to be one of the key criteria when we think about voting for a president. Will they be effective negotiators internally with their staffs, externally with the public, externally with allies? So if you were thinking about how a voter should identify whether a potential presidential candidate would be an effective negotiator, what should they look to?
Well, track record is important. How have they fared negotiating to get to the point where they're candidate for president? Did they really roll over people? Did they work with people cooperatively? Did they have bipartisan kind of instincts? And you can judge some things, but of course, when you get to be president, there's no real preparation for it because it's the toughest job in the world in many ways. So many people operated as president differently than you might have expected. But so generally, you can just get as much information as you can and try to make a decision. And we do a pretty good job of getting people information now about what a president's like compared to the old days when Abraham Lincoln was elected and people didn't really even know who he was. Just those days, candidates didn't even campaign. In the early part of our country's history, up until probably the middle part of the 20th century, candidates ran for president, but they didn't campaign. It was considered inappropriate to campaign, so you didn't really get to talk to them or know them very well. You had to listen to surrogates. Now, at least we get to judge them a little bit more through debates or public speeches or things that have been written about them.
Probably a lot of the presidents pre-modern times couldn't withstand the scrutiny of the media today and probably wouldn't be elected. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. For example, George Washington, was well liked, admired because he won the war, but, he couldn't smile. He didn't have any teeth. So what would that look? Abraham Lincoln was gangly kind of person and was a very awkward person in many ways, didn't have the image that people would like of a president today. James Madison was 5'4". Can you imagine electing a 5'4" person today as president? So they were different kind of situations. Today, we do a lot of examination of our presidents, but maybe we still get presidents in who operate differently than we expected.
Of the presidents, it sounds like you've had personal relationships with all the presidents since President Carter, who you worked directly for. As you think about those presidents, what are some of the key attributes which would separate those that you feel are effective at negotiation and less effective?
Well, I think the best presidents are ones that are bipartisan in many ways, presidents that have some amount of humility, presidents that are willing to share the credit, people that are willing to take the blame. I think those are important attributes: sharing the credit, taking the blame when something goes wrong. John Kennedy famously took the blame for Bay of Pigs and actually increased his popularity, ironically. And since that time, many presidents have said, I take the blame for this, though sometimes they really don't mean that. And then I think also the really good presidents are people that want to make the American people happier and better and really are not interested in making themselves happier or better. They're interested in helping the American people. And it's, some people have that instinct. They want to help others and some people don't.
In terms of bipartisanship, one of the presidents who you mentioned in the book left happy, served 2 terms and left with his reputation intact was Barack Obama. Yet he didn't seem to negotiate very well with the Republican Congress. I remember one of the early things he did was encouraged to go have a beer with Mitch McConnell and said, would you want to have a beer with that guy? What do you think about President Obama's, being stonewalled by Congress? Either was that a good strategy for the Republicans? Are there things that he could have done different to ingratiate himself there more?
Well, President Obama came into office and many people felt he really wasn't quite qualified. He'd been a senator in the United States Senate for just a few years. Also, I think from the beginning, there were some real racial and other concerns by his opponents about his being president of the United States, whether it was appropriate to have him as president. And he faced a lot of, in my view, virtually no willingness by the Republicans to be bipartisan. And remember, his great contribution, the Affordable Care Act, barely passed the Congress. It passed by one or two votes. I said, fully forced through in the end by Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. So I think he found it difficult to deal with the Republicans. They didn't want to deal with him. They didn't regard him as almost legitimate, and so it was not his fault. But I think he found unwillingness to have people talk with him on the Republican side.
A couple other questions on specific presidents that maybe weren't in your book. As I mentioned, you did a subset of presidents. President Reagan, I recently read Max Boot from the Council on Foreign Relations book on President Reagan. It really changed how I thought about him. That was when I grew up in the 80s. We know that he was one of the great communicators. He had sort of a nickname of that. But how do you feel about President Reagan and his persuasiveness and the job he did as president?
Well, I did interview Max Boot about his Reagan book. I didn't put it in this book because I'd already done an interview about Reagan, so I was looking for different presidents. But Reagan was a very likable person. He had, certain views that he had ingrained into him, which is less government spending, more military spending, and so forth, and smaller government, and he basically lived for those precepts. He was not a person who dug into details, unlike Jimmy Carter. He kind of let his staff do a lot of the details, but in many ways, he looked the part of a president. He played the part of a president quite well. And I think his impact was significant in terms of taking the Republican Party further to the right and away from the center. But even he seems like a moderate today compared to what we now have the Republican Party. But I think Reagan deserves a lot of credit for many of the things he did. Clearly, he had a scandal at the end, the Iran-Contra scandal, but he survived that and did okay. And so today, I think Reagan is pretty well regarded by people as a general rule of thumb.
You had a chapter on George Herbert Walker Bush, but not on George W. Bush. The big sort of thing that will stick with him throughout history is the decision to invade Iraq. Did you ever get any insight from whether it was James Baker or others, how he was persuaded to do that? The conventional wisdom is that those around him, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, kind of ganged up on him and pushed him. Is that your perspective, or what do you know about that persuasion?
Well, my sense from afar is that when we did not get Osama bin Laden in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was an ongoing effort to kind of get revenge and to get people who had either been involved with that effort or could potentially do damage to us in the future. And I think some people in the administration, I think probably Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, took the view that Saddam Hussein was somebody that should be punished and that he was somehow involved in 9/11, though there's no real evidence of that. So they persuaded people, and including the Congress, to support that effort. And it turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction, to the embarrassment of many people in the administration, including people like Colin Powell, who had advocated for the invasion. So it was a sad situation. And in hindsight, I don't think President Bush would say he made a mistake. I think he has said that had he known there were no weapons of mass destruction, he probably would not have proceeded. But at the time, he thought there were.
Yeah, unfortunate. President Biden, you have a close relationship with former President Biden. The key negotiation recently with him was persuading him not to run after his debate performance. Were you involved in that? What do you know about that persuasion?
No, I was not involved. I think what happened was pretty much what's been reported, that he had made a decision to run. There was never a meeting at the White House that said, let's decide, should we run or not run? Apparently, no such meeting occurred. It was always assumed that he would run. And so they moved forward on that basis. And then they had the idea of challenging Donald Trump to a debate very early, thinking that they could, do well in that debate and ultimately help themselves. But it turned out to probably be a mistake, because by debating so early, when President Biden didn't do that well, there was time for somebody else to run in his place. Had the debate been in September or October, there would not have been a time to replace President Biden. And President Biden, I think, still thinks, so I can't speak for him, that he probably would have won the election had he run.
Yeah. The last foreign policy question I'd like to ask you is around China. Obviously, China is front and center in terms of important relationship for the U.S. going forward. They're a competitor in many ways, friend in some ways. How do you feel like the current administration is doing on its approach to China?
Well, Chinese relationship is challenging for any administration. I don't think the Biden administration had a perfect relationship with China either. The president's tariffs have obviously upset President Xi Jinping, but when President Trump met with Xi Jinping recently in Asia, they seem to have resolved a lot of the issues related to the tariffs and the rare minerals. So right now, I think the relationship is reasonably in good shape. But clearly, when you have a country that's powerful as China in terms of economy, defense, and other kinds of things, and technology, there's always going to be some rivalries. And as Graham Allison pointed out in his book, The Thucydides Trap, whenever you have two big powers, a rising power and a dominant power, historically, they often go to war. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they will always go to war, but clearly there's some tension that I think is not going to get resolved anytime soon between these two most powerful countries on the face of the earth.
Just to wrap up, a couple of quick questions. Is there a current public figure, it could be in politics, it could be in business, that you feel like you admire as a negotiator, someone that you've either dealt with or observed, or you say, that person's really an effective negotiator?
Well, there are a lot of people that I admire in public life and in private life. I'd say in the business world, I think many people greatly respect the job that Jamie Dimon has done as leader of J.P. Morgan. He's really made that bank, the most valuable bank in the world, and very impressive person for sure. In the political world, there are many people that I admire, but I'm afraid if I mention one or two, I'm going to get emails from people saying, how come you didn't mention me? But, Democratic Party and the Republican Party have some very talented people, some of whom will no doubt emerge as a potential presidential candidate at some point. You just never know who's going to emerge right now. It's too early to say. If you go back and look at who is likely to be president of the United States 2 years in advance of an election, you almost always will be wrong. You wouldn't have predicted 2 years in advance that Jimmy Carter would be elected, Barack Obama would have been elected, that George Herbert Walker Bush would have been elected, Bill Clinton would have been elected. You wouldn't have predicted that 2 years in advance because they were not the leading candidates necessarily at the time.
Final question. How important do you think negotiation is as kind of a horizontal skill as you think about all the success that you've had in business, in government, the nonprofit world, and philanthropy? How important has negotiation been to that success?
Well, I think the ability to get along with people is successful. Nobody can do something by themselves. I mean, even Einstein coming up with E equals MC squared couldn't convince people by himself that it was right. You have some power of persuasion, you have to do some other things. You have to persuade people of things, and the ability to persuade people and negotiate is a very important skill. And the best negotiators, like Jim Baker, for example, were very successful. People that say that they're correct all the time and there's no negotiation, they generally don't succeed as often as people who are willing to negotiate. So I think, as President Kennedy said his inaugural address, we should never be afraid of negotiating. And so I think negotiation is a skill set that great politicians have.
David, that's a good place to end. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your service to the country.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.